What do you think?
Earth movement, cracking the skin.
Part of it. So imagine what's touching the skimmer. So you have a plastic meeting up with some sort of cement, typically gravel, all right? So as they expand and contract, as things get warmer and colder, or if anything shifts, they don't move or shift at the same rate, right? So that's one of your most likely places. So anything where cement comes in contact with plastic is a very likely place, especially since cement doesn't stick exceptionally well to plastic. Right? There's not a great bond there. So a very common place for it to leak in that throat. And so sometimes what you'll do is you're looking in the skimmer, even with your mirror, is you can't really tell. It looks like a crack, but you're not sure. And sometimes you'll take your knife and just kind of tap it, and all of a sudden your knife will bury it. Guess what? You have a big void. You may not have seen it visually, but sometimes just kind of tapping on the edges, you'll be able to tell if something's an actual void or just a little gap on the surface. Okay? We talked about a process that's important. And the reason that's important is you go in with, I mentioned, having your eyes wide open when you're looking for a leak, because a lot of times it's not what you suspect. So I'm going to talk about a couple scenarios where it looked like it was going to be one thing, but it ended up being another. But we also want to talk about whether you really have it. So what is the average evaporation rate for a pool? How do you know whether something's leaking or just evaporating?
1.5 inches a week.
How much?
1.5 inches a week.
So usually when they rate it, they say in 24 hours, in one day. So how much do you think you should leak in? I'm not saying you're wrong, but we're going to get back to that. So what should you lose on average in a pool in 24 hours? So typically they say 1/8 of an inch or so in the winter and about 1/4 of an inch in the summer. But that's rather misleading. There are even some leak detections who print that this is what you expect to leak. If you have more than that, you're leaking. But what factors will contribute to something leaking more or less? So what will contribute to more evaporation loss than that average of 1/4 of an inch? What do you think changes that?
Water features.
Water what?
Water features.
Water features, 100%. So anytime you aerate water, you dramatically increase the evaporation. So if you have shear descents, waterfalls, rock falls, spillovers on spas, anytime you're aerating water, you increase the evaporation rate. What else affects the evaporation rate? Wind. I'm going to give you an example. So I had two good guys that did leak detection for me. And they went out to a pool, both of them, 2 days in a row, and they could not find the leak. It was leaking 1 inch a day. So 1 inch a day is a pretty good leak, right? So I went out there, I dove the pool, I could not find the leak. So with a little bit of testing, we're going to talk about bucket tests in a few minutes, but based on where that pool was, it was on the point right on the ocean, so wind hit right across this pool, and because of the wind, they lost in evaporation. I did a bucket test, 1 inch a day, because the wind howls across it all the time. So wind, an unprotected pool, or an area that has tons of wind, can be dramatically more than 1/4 of an inch. So 1 inch is the most I had ever seen before. I didn't believe it until I proved it to myself. But the point is, you have to go in with an open mind, but you want to make sure that it has a leak. So before you spend a lot of time or resources or money finding a leak, make sure you have it. Make sense? So what makes you guys determine whether you think you have a leak in one of your pools? What are some of the telltale signs? Water bill, that's good. Because a lot of times you go and it's full all the time. The homeowners never said anything. So what else can tell you? Because you may not see the water bill. Maybe they are new to the house where they've had it forever and they don't notice anything. And they have an autofill. They never had water. You never had water. So what else would be an indication that your pool's leaking?
Lots of chlorine.
Chlorine, chemicals. So things like salt, conditioner. If you keep putting that in and you can't keep a reading, that tells you you're diluting the water, right? So you have a leak. So autofills are fantastic. However, it can hide which, when you have a leak. So that's one of the telltale signs. Okay. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. Again, you want to determine when you have a leak. So history of leak detection, one of the things that people used to do once upon a time is, this is going back old school, before my time, but they actually would, if they suspected they had a leak in a pool, like a subterranean leak, you know how they did it? It seems rather archaic, it is, but they would literally drill holes in the deck and then take a piece of rebar, pound it down in there, lift it up and see if it was wet. And that's how they would do it. Trust me, they did have it. It seems stupid, and I guess it kind of is, but that's the way they did it for a long time. Now we have high-tech means of finding leaks. So we talked about the tools, some of the basic things. Even something as simple as a mask is critical. Because if it's anything underground, under the water, without a mask, you can't see it. But even if you're not diving in the pool, a mask can still be helpful. Because if you're dive testing, the pool returns, and you lay that right on the water, now you can see crystal clear when you're putting the dive. Because if you don't do that, especially if it's windy, with the surface tension broken, you can't really see what that dye is doing. And you're really trying to be like you were right next to it. So a mask will be one of those things that really everybody should have. If you're going to do any type of leak detection, even basic, a mask, dye, and a mirror are going to be critical to you. Real important. Right? So the other things that we've done, because we have more technology now, if we find and determine that something is a leak underground, not if you went earlier about a spa, I believe a pool and a spa, both had a leak, they were both subterranean, and a leak detection found it. But you want to know, even if you know that there's a leak, you want to know where it's at. So you're not going to, because there's a leak underground, you're not going to replumb everything. What's really the problem? So first of all, you determine if it's a plumbing leak. So if we've gone through and determined that all extrusions, which is the returns around the drains, at the light, if we've checked those things and they aren't leaking, then you go to the plumbing. So to determine whether pipes leak, the way you do it is we put plugs in all of the plumbing and then pressure it up. So this rig basically helps us to put air in the lines. We can pressure that up, and if all the plumbing holds, this gauge is going to remain constant. If it drops, what does that tell you? We have a leak somewhere in the plumbing. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So if you have a leak, now how do you determine where it is? You might get lucky and hear a whistle somewhere, that air is escaping. But that's 1 out of 10,000 times. Most times it's not that simple. So you have to use something like this, which is geophones. So these geophones, what this does is allow you to go around, once you have pressure in that plumbing, you're going to go through and determine where, because it will create a sound where that air or water is escaping. Now go back to pressure checking plumbing. There's a few tricks you need to understand. So when you are pressure checking something and the pressure drops, remember that the way that that pressure drops will vary depending on what's in the lines. So if you put air in the lines, you probably have what in the lines? Air and water, right? You have both. But when you have a leak, air will escape from a hole or a crack faster than water. So depending on where that pipe is cracked will change not only the way it sounds, but also the way that that pressure drops. So a quicker drop would suggest it's air, not water. Whereas if it's on the bottom of the pipe, that's where the water's going to stay longer. It will take longer for all that water to be purged out and just the air. So there's a little bit of a trick there in determining what you have. But the first thing to determine is, do I have a leak? If I have a leak, let's go to the most obvious things. Let's check the skimmer. You mentioned that lights are one of the most common leaks. So why do lights leak? What do you think? What's the reason for? A couple of reasons maybe.
We don't pressure test them.
Right, they don't pressure check the conduit. In fact, behind that light, behind that niche, you have conduit that goes up to a junction box. So that doesn't get pressure tested like the rest of the plumbing. And that water always has water, right? And water will seek its own level. So in that conduit, it's going to go up to whatever level the pool is. So The first thing you check is, visually, you can pull a light out and take a look around the niche. There could be a crack in the niche. The back of the nut can leak, but more often than not, it's actually in the conduit. And so how does that get fixed? Typically, what you're gonna do, unless you're gonna be doing some major renovations and tearing up the deck, you're gonna seal that from the inside, right? So you don't really need water in that conduit. You need water in the niche because it cools the light. So you have that water back here, you can't seal it from the front, but you don't need water behind it. So your products they make to actually seal it in the front if you have a leak in the light. So let's talk about some situations or some scenarios where it seemed obvious, but it wasn't what you thought. I mentioned the one with the evaporation rate of 1 inch a day. I'll give you another one. So we had a pool that was dropping right to the bottom of the returns and stopping. So, and before I ever got there, they already told me that that was the case. So where's the leak?
In the return system.
That's what I assumed. So I pressure up the returns, held pressure. Huh, maybe it's the light. So I checked the light, didn't leak. Huh,
Vacuum line.
no vacuum line. Commercial pool, big pool. So that, well, maybe it's in the plaster somewhere where it's stopping. Check that, all tight and good. Make a long story short, as we go through the process, it was leaking in the main drain. So why did it stop at the returns? So it's a suction line in the main drain, so why did it stop there?
Incorrect plumbing.
What's that?
The incorrect plumbing.
Old pool, been there 30 years. There's a crack in the main drain line that was just happened to be at the level of the returns. So what I assume, I was wrong. So when you're doing leak detections, don't go in with too many assumptions. Because there are situations where it seems like it's gonna be a simple identification, it has nothing to do with what you thought. Usually when main drains leak, they're at the drain. They're not up under the deck, 30 feet away. This one was. But again, it fooled me for a little bit. It took me a little time to find it, but once I got everything under pressure, then we identified exactly what it was. Something else that will help you to determine when you have a leak in a suction line like a main drain or a skimmer, maybe even before you realize the water is losing water, is you open up your pump basket and all of a sudden there's all kinds of gravel and dirt and mud. Where did that come from? Most likely you have a broken line and it's sucking all that stuff in. Something else that can change your leaks is it will leak a lot and then kind of slow down. What do you think might cause that?
Pressure.
Could be
Saturated soil.
saturation. Yeah. So once you saturate it, it doesn't absorb the water as quickly. So you're still leaking. The size of the hole didn't change, but now that there's a lot of water around it, it doesn't escape as quickly. So again, you're being a sleuth here. You're being a detective and trying to determine what could cause this. And so the process is to start to eliminate things. You eliminate the obvious first, and then move to the next page. You don't start with the leak detection by diving to the bottom of the pool and check the main drain. That's not where you start.
Hey Rick,
Start
speaking of that, do you have a list of easiest to more difficult? You know what I mean? Because that would be nice to be able to say, okay, let's check the backwash line first, because that's the most obvious place that you could have a leak.
Yeah, so my guys actually have a list of kind of what they do, what they check first. And even pressure checking the plumbing, that's not the first thing we check. We test it if we don't find the more obvious things like light around it. We talk about extrusion. So anytime you have a hole in the shell, that's an extrusion that heats up with plastic. Those are common places for them to leak. So it doesn't mean if a return is leaking that it's leaking inside the plumbing. It could be leaking around that fit. Same with around the conduit or on the throat of the skimmer. So those are things that are obvious and relatively easy to find, and that's where you start. But first of all, you walk around. So I always tell my guys, before you even get to the pool, walk around. Start to look. Look for a backwash line. Look for a planter that's wet. Look for something that looks unusual. Look for, if you have one section of deck that's caving in, that's suspicious, right? You look at the tile line. Are there huge cracks in the tile? That's a pretty good indication, and of course you can dye test that. But you want to go with vision first. I'll give you another example of one that was, my guys couldn't find it, and they struggled to find this. To make a long story short, before I even got to the pool, I just walked around the perimeter, just to kind of see if I noticed anything unusual, because everything held, they put all the plumbing under pressure held, they dye tested everything, it looked good. But in this case, as I walked around, all of a sudden I almost fall, and my foot sinks about this far into some mulch. Well, the mulch floats, so you couldn't see it, but there was a big gaping hole with water in it. It was a broken air line. That wasn't under pressure. They didn't pressure that part of it, and so they didn't find it. It was an easy fix. It was just something that nobody had ever glued. They shoved the pipe together, never glued it. It was a 15-minute fix once we identified it. But you had to kind of go out of the box to look at the broad scope of things to find those things. One of the other things that we use that is very helpful is we have a meter that detects when there is a leak. It will actually tell us how many gallons per day it leaks. And it takes into consideration some of the things that we talked about: wind, humidity, water temperature, air temperature, because all of those things will change the evaporation rate. So when we're calculating an actual water leak, we need to know those things. So if you have a pool that's set to 90 degrees, it's super windy, and you have a whole bunch of waterfalls, you have to factor that in, right? Because a quarter of an inch a day isn't gonna give you an accurate reading as to whether something's leaking or not. So you need to kind of be able to factor those things in. So that device that we use will tell us, after all those things are taken into consideration, if in fact the pool's leaking. We use it so that after we find a leak, and even do a temporary patch, we check that to make sure there are no additional leaks. So oftentimes what will happen is a leak detection company will go out there that doesn't do that. They'll find a leak and say, you're good to go. So about 6 months ago, I went to a woman's house in Laguna, a very bright lady. She hired a leak detection. They found a crack in the tile that was leaking. They sealed it, said you're good to go. She paid them. Everything was good. Pool was still leaking. So she didn't trust it. So she hired another leak detection company. They came out, oh, you have a leak here in your skimmer. They fixed it. You're good to go. Still leaking. So in this case, there was a third leak. I found it. It was actually in the pebble. There was a crack in the bench. But this device allows us to not do that. So if there's more than one leak, we're going to find it. And that's really what you want to do. You can't keep charging customers over and over again for the same leak detection. And your clients don't want to hear that. They want somebody to go in and find it, you fix it, and you move on. So that's helpful. Not everybody does that, but it is something that's very helpful. Another issue that sometimes can happen is you had mentioned light. So I'll give you an example of where how a leak in a light can be a little deceptive. So we had a pool that dropped to the bottom of the skimmer, okay, and then it dropped a little, slowed down, but continued to drop, and it dropped right to the top step of the pool. So probably not the skimmer because it dropped below the skimmer, below the tie line. Tie line looked it was ragged, in bad shape, but it dropped below the tie line when it dropped. Ended up being the light issue. So it was in that port, it got sealed up, and that was it. But when we visually looked at it, the tile was in such bad shape and there were so many cracks, the first assumption was, that's your problem. Your skimmer's terrible, it's all cracked, you have all this cracked tile, but once we fixed the light, none of the other stuff leaked. It looked like it could leak, it was suspicious, and probably needed to be addressed at some point, but that's not where it was leaking. And so again, you want to go through the process and never assume that you know what it's leaking. Even if a homeowner tells you, well, I know the skimmer is leaking, or I know this is leaking because this is what happens. So you want to keep your eyes open, but take everything you hear with a grain of salt. When someone tells you, one of your clients says, I'm adding X amount of inches every day, it's dropping 3 inches a day. So do you assume that they're accurate? They might be. I had a client a while back. This was a first for me, but he suspected he had a leak in his pool and he had an autofill. He physically installed a water meter on his autofill, so he could tell me how many gallons per hour he lost. He knew, but most of the time they don't. They're just kind of guessing. So we talked about autofills, how they're a good thing, but they can be negative, so you have to be very careful. And obviously, if you're doing a leak detection, you need to shut that autofill off, so you really know what you're dealing with, right? But the other thing is, when you're trying to factor in how much something loses, everybody's heard of the bucket test, right? So how many people have tried or used a bucket test, or at least understand it? So, good portion of the class here. So are bucket tests accurate? Does everybody know how a bucket test works? They will explain. So you take a bucket, you put it on the top step of the pool. You put a mark in the pool somewhere, whether it's in the skimmer or on the tile with a piece of tape or a pencil, however you mark it. And then you do the same thing with the bucket. You put water in the bucket, same level of the pool, and you mark that. And you see if they both drop at the same rate. You have the same water temperature, and so if you have a leak in the pool, it's going to drop faster than the mark in the bucket. Make sense? So are they accurate? That's a great question. So sort of. So you are getting the same conditions for the most part. Same water temperature, same air temperature, same humidity. If you fill the bucket and mark it, you could get the same wind situation. But what you can't account for is aeration. So if you have any type of water features, it will increase the evaporation over what the bucket is. The other thing it can't tell you is if you have an issue with the plumbing, if you have a leak in the plumbing, it's not going to reflect on it. So bucket tests can be helpful. I'm not suggesting that you don't use them. They can be accurate, but they have their limitations. So don't trust that it's 100% accurate. Because just because your pool loses more than your bucket doesn't necessarily mean you have a leak. If you have a bunch of water features, you're going to lose more than you will in the bucket. Because the water's not moving the same, it's not being aerated. Okay.
Hey, Rick?
Yep.
The question I have about that, and I've always wondered this in all these years, people always explain it, you put a piece of tape on the tile and a piece of tape on the bucket. If you equalize the water inside and outside, all you need to do is put a piece of tape on the outside of the bucket. You don't need one on the pool, right? Because now you're just looking at what the difference is.
Correct.
So everybody always says that, and I always wondered why.
Yeah. I always mark the skimmer anyway, but I always level the water in the bucket to the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did one of
It's
those
just a
nuts
second
in
mark.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you put a rock in your bucket?
Well, a rock, the only thing that's going to do is keep it from blowing over and falling and moving and messing up your test.
Well-
The rock itself doesn't make any difference, but if you certainly want it weighted enough where it's not going to float away.
Yeah, because a plastic pail is gonna, even if it's equal, it's gonna.
Well, and of course you need a bucket that doesn't leak, so that kind of goes without saying. But so bucket tests work, but they have their limitations. So just remember, aeration and wind have a huge impact on what.
I have a question.
So
you were saying that the bucket, when you have features on the pool, you understand that the bucket test doesn't really tell you, but what about you were saying something about the plumbing?
right. So if you have let's talk about different types of leaks. So if you have a static leak, which is just seeping out of something, you have a hole in the skimmer throat or in the light switch, it's going to leak at whatever the rate is. There's a little bit of a variation in that because the same size hole right below the tile line is going to leak at a different rate than the same size hole in a main drain. Why? Water pressure. The weight of that water will push it through faster. But in general, a static leak will leak at a pretty consistent rate. But if it's a plumbing leak, if it's on a pressure side, on a return, and you have a crack in the pipe, when the pump is on, it's going to leak dramatically faster than if it's off, right? It still may leak even with the pump off, but if it leaks faster when it's on, you likely have a hole or a crack in the pipe. What about the suction side? How would that vary whether the pump is on or off? So if you have a leak in the line between the skimmer and the pump underground, and with the pump running, you lose a half an inch a day. And then you shut the pump off, what might happen?
Will slow
Might lose more.
You might lose more. Because of its suction line, it's under a vacuum. So as you vacuum, you're not really losing any. You might be drawing a little air, but you're probably not losing as much water. Once it shuts off, that vacuum stops and you'll actually lose more. That's where that little device we have is helpful, because we can change those water features and see what happens in real time within a few minutes and kind of see. But there is a variation in how that works. Okay? We talked about the different types of leaks that you have. Again, you want to determine, first of all, do you have a leak? That's the most important part of it. But the second of all is know where to look first. So we talked about A to Z. So A is walk the pool. Look at the backwash valve. Look at the equipment carefully. Look at the skimmer throat. Look at the tile line, because where the plaster meets up with the tile, very common place it can leak. Again, anything where you have two surfaces meeting up can leak. We talked about using dye. There's a couple different, some people will use number 4, phenol red. That works. When I use the yellow, this fluorescent yellow, I like to use it in dark pools, whether it's plaster, quartz, or pebble, because it's easier to see. But in white plaster, this is hard to see, so I like to use a darker dye. That's up to you. But what do you think is the hardest pool if it's actually in the surface? So a gunite or shotcrete shell of a pool, that's the structure. That's what gives you the strength for the pool. Is that a waterproof shell? It will not waterproof. So if you have any holes in your pool surface, plaster or pebble or quartz, it most certainly can leak. And so sometimes a leak can be as methodical as going through and looking for, first of all, imperfections. But then you have to use a dye test and see. So sometimes they're difficult to find. I was telling a few of the guys earlier this morning, one of the most difficult leaks I had was, it was dark as this. Dark pattern, very hard to see. And I swam the pool twice around and I couldn't find anything. I knew the plumbing was good, I knew the light was good, all the extrusions were good. It was somewhere in the surface. I knew that because I eliminated all the other things. And that's what leak detection is. It's a process of elimination. You start eliminating things. So I knew it was in the shell somewhere. And so as I swam around the second time trying to dye test everything and I couldn't see anything, I just happened to notice a feather sticking in the side of the pebble. That's a little unusual. So not sticking out real far, but I pulled it out, put my dye, and just sucked it right in. So a feather that happened to be floating in the water and just happened to be close enough and sucked it right in.
You got lucky.
Got lucky. Yeah. But sometimes that's what it takes. It just takes a little bit of time and persistence in finding it. But again, we're not going through a course where I'm teaching you for 6 months. We're going through the basics. From your standpoint, whether you're building pools or remodeling pools or repairing pools or servicing pools, you want to know whether there is a leak. If there is a leak, look at the obvious first. Make sure that it's not something obvious, because if you're going to pay or have your client pay for a leak detection and it's something simple, save your money, do it yourself and find it. If it is more complicated, then hire somebody like us to actually find the leak, locate it, pinpoint it, because with this we can pinpoint usually within about 12 to 14 inches. That's really what you want. Because if it's a subterranean leak, you don't want to be tearing out whole sections of deck or guessing. You want to know. Because sometimes when you have, let's say you have a planter that's real wet, you know your pool's leaking, your pressure doesn't hold, okay, it's going to be right there. What's the problem with that? Assuming where it might be leaking without using some sort of geophones in identifying where it is. What can happen?
Water moves.
Yeah, follows the path of least resistance. So I'll give you an example. You've all seen, you might have one at your house, a portable hot tub, right? So the portable hot tubs are above ground, they're usually wrapped with some sort of composite material or some redwood perhaps. And if you've ever opened those up, you notice that they're all encased with foam. And the manufacturer will tell you, we do that because we're insulated. That's not why they do it. Does it insulate it? A little. Most of your heat is lost up the top, not on the sides. So that's not why they do it. They do it for transportation. Because after they finish building it, they've got to put this on a truck, it's got to be lifted up and down, it's got to be walked in the backyard, and if they didn't encase it with foam, is that those pipes move and jiggle, they're all going to break. That's why they encase it with foam. But that being said, if you've ever had one and you've had a leak, if it leaks out of this corner I can just about guarantee you that's not where it's leaking. It's probably leaking on the opposite corner. That's been my experience. Because water will follow around that foam, follow that pipe, and end up wherever it can find its way out. So where you see it leaking doesn't mean anything. And the same is true with underground plumbing. Just because you see water here doesn't mean it's not 80 feet away where the leak is. Because it can travel that pipe or the old trench, and wherever it can get out, that's where it's going to get out. So be careful not to start tearing out deck before you know. And that's the purpose of the class. You want to identify the easy things, but if it's complicated, if you're not sure and you don't have the right equipment, don't start demoing deck when it could have been a much easier fix. One was telling me this morning about a difficult repair he had, where they had to go down 7 feet to get to a pipe. So if you're going to be tunneling to repair something, you want to be sure where it's at. If you have to saw concrete, you want to be sure how little of a patch of concrete can I cut out. What's the least I can get by with, not the biggest. So the customers say, hey, just take this whole panel. Beautiful. But a lot of times they say, remove as little as you possibly can. So if you're guessing and you start opening up deck and you keep going further and further, you can get yourself in trouble. The other issue is, I'm going to take point with a pool builder here. So, and I built pools for years. In the United States, there's no consistency as to the way pool builders build pools. There just isn't. There's no universal rules of how you should or shouldn't do things. I wish there was, but there's not. So, in regards to what has to do with leak detection, a lot of plumbing, you assume things, and someone said earlier that you learn something new every week, and you think you've seen it all. That happens to me all the time. So sometimes what seems logical or seems simple, this is the way I would have plumbed it. It's a straight shot, it's super simple, and for whatever reasons that didn't happen. I went to pull a light maybe a year ago now, but it was a straight shot from a spot. I could see the junction box. It was 20 feet away. When I pulled my fish tape through, it was 74 feet. How do you get 74 feet? So they went around, and I don't know why. There was no reason that I could see. Maybe there was a reason. I don't know, or they just had extra conduit. I don't know. But it's not always what you would assume. We had a leak detection and then a repair where they had the plumbing was here, the leak was here, and in a jet, there's a big planter of huge palm trees, 80-foot palm trees right in front. So that, well, let's open up the deck right here because the plumbing is going to go. It's a straight shot. It's less than 20 feet. That's the way they would have run it. And then we can access it without having to worry about the palm tree. They didn't go that way. They went all the way around the pool through the planter to feed this return. There's no reason for it. It didn't make any sense. There's no logic to it. But I assumed that I was wrong. So sometimes you're going to run into that. So be careful when you assume things because it may lead you down the wrong path and you end up with more work, is my point. So if you run into something and it's not something basic and you're going to hire a leak detection company, we give you a $100 referral fee. You don't have to use us. I take pride in what we do and how we do it. We try and make sure we're thorough. But when we get referrals, it's not just a referral fee, but we'll talk to you before we even talk to the customer as far as the report. We'll tell you what we found, where the problem is, and then you guys determine how you, whether you want us to fix it or you guys want to fix it. That's, however you guys want to handle it. It's fine. But we'll kind of leave that in your hands, how you want to process it. The other thing is we're not going to throw you in the bus. Sometimes we do go out and it's simply a leak in the backwash valve, and we're not going to throw the pool. I mean, poor guy should have seen this. It's super obvious. Or yeah, the pump's leaking. It's right there. But we're not going to do that to you. We might tell you that, hey, listen, this was really simple. You could have saved yourself some money and just fixed it. But we'll tell you that privately. We're not going to do that in front of your customers. Okay? But it is important to ask the questions. So what questions do you guys have in regards to leak detection, how you do it, the process? Any questions? How you do it, why you do it, when you do it? I hope at least you appreciate when you need leak detection. So first of all, your goal should be, you obviously want to make the most money possible. You want to make your jobs as profitable as can be, new construction or not. And there are a lot of new construction techniques that will prevent you or lessen the likelihood of leaks. But as we mentioned at the outset, all pools at some point are likely to leak. Everybody thinks that a leak is gonna be some gaping hole the size of this plug in the bottom of their pool. That's what everybody envisions. The reality is, most holes are about the size of that, the tip of my pen. They're not huge gaping holes, but that's not what people envision. They also think when you have electronic devices that it's like a divining rod and it just points you, there's your leak right there. It's not that simple. There's a little more involved. I wish it was. If it was a vinyl liner, I can actually say it actually is pretty easy. Because with a vinyl liner, because vinyl doesn't carry a charge, you can actually put a charge in the pool and use a locator and follow the charge, and I can tell you exactly where the leak is at. Unfortunately, most of us aren't dealing with vinyl pools. In concrete pools, the current will go through it. So that doesn't work. So leak detection is a process. It's a matter of eliminating the most obvious first. And that's why I said that the steps of A to Z are important, because when you go in assuming something because of what you see, be careful it doesn't lead you down the wrong path and you spend a lot of time on something you didn't need. And sometimes that's what will happen. Okay?
So you had mentioned before about that customer that had a leak, then they called another company out because they had another leak, and then another company. Do you give a pool a clean bill of health? In other words, do you do a leak detection, find a leak, fix it, and then detect any other leaks after that? Because especially in plumbing, there can be multiple leaks, but even in a pool, there can be multiple leaks. So how do you do that? How does that work? Because I don't really know those other companies. Hey, we fixed a leak, you're good. But should they have done more testing? Is that what you're saying, or what?
Especially since both her and her husband are both attorneys.
That
And
is-
they're gonna go after both of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in this case, I found the leak in the bench in the spa. And so I did a temporary patch while I was there. And I assured her, I said, I know I have your leak, and I set up my device to prove that it wasn't leaking, but I said, I'm guaranteeing you, this is the leak. This isn't the permanent fix, but it won't leak anymore. But I'm gonna call you tomorrow morning, and you're gonna tell me when I call you up, thank you so much, because it's not leaking anymore. I knew it because I had that device that proved it to me. I already knew that I got the leak and that there were no additional leaks. That third leak was it. So I did the temporary patch. I called her in the morning. It's you, Rick, right? I said, yep. She goes, you're absolutely right. We're not leaking anymore. Thank you so much. We're great. Now we're ready to move on with the repair. So the permanent repair had to replaster the spot. There was really a whole lot of issues, but we sealed it. So thank you for the question, but that's what we do is we can temporary patch most things.
So if
Just
it's a
verify there's nothing else.
If it's a plumbing leak, you put it under pressure and it's leaking, you fix that, do you put it under pressure again?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So and plumbing leaks are not as common as you think. They're not the most common, but they happen. Especially if you have, I'm sure anybody who has a route, you're going to have probably some pools that still have copper lines. Right? Copper lines, if they're not leaking now, they will leak eventually. As water washes through them, copper is a soft metal, and eventually the chlorinated water is going to eat through it. You're going to end up with pinholes. It's going to happen, just a matter of time. Slowly, they're all disappearing because they're leaking, people are replumbing their pools, but eventually it will happen. So when we make a repair, as soon as we're done, the first thing we do is put everything under pressure to make sure there's not additional leaks. And with subterranean plumbing, that's very important. If we have one, you certainly could have two. And so we need to pressure check that to make sure, once you're there, you want to make sure you're not going back a second time. That's not good for you, and it's not good for us. You know, what your clients want is just that we trust you, you take care of it, and we want to make sure that you maintain that trust. We want to make sure that once you have us out there, we find it, we fix it, or we let you fix it, but we verify there's no other leaks, so your client can be happy to move on.
If you pressurize a gas line to like 10 psi or so, and it holds for an hour, what if, is it likely to hold for days, or is there ever any, let's say take a week later, it's all leaked out. Would you say, well, there is something there, but that's so small, I don't know.
Well, gas lines are a little different than water, but it either holds pressure or it doesn't.
Okay.
So sometimes what will happen is you will have to, before you pour a deck, you put everything under pressure. You leave it under pressure until the deck is done. The reason you do that is so that if somebody hits something or breaks a line, you know right away. So before you move on, you go fix it before you have to tear out a brand new deck. But when we pressure test something, you bring it up, and if it's leaking, the first thing you do, if it's a small leak, you're gonna check your plugs, make sure it's not bypassing there. But if it's a really small leak, it's most likely a fig and not a broken line. But again, that will determine how quickly it leaks. With water plumbing, it's a little different because you have air and potentially water. You have water with potentially air there as well. And so it reacts a little differently. As that pressure builds up, it's slow, and then once it finally gets that water out of there, all of a sudden it just plummets and it drops real quickly. So, but part of that we can determine not only when we're watching the pressure, but also by listening to it. We can hear because the sound that breaking a pipe makes with water is one sound, and then once it starts to get bubbles and then air, it changes the sound.
But if you're just watching a meter, you would see it within an hour typically.
Yes, it's either gonna hold or it's not. I mean, a really small leak could be so incremental that it might take a while to notice it. But a leak is a leak.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions?
When you're doing remodels, obviously pressure test all your lines, how do you kind of ensure that the overall shell, it's been sealed correctly on the pipes?
So you always have to seal all your extrusions. So whenever you do a remodel, you always have to seal those. Hydraulic is a good way of doing that. So all of them need to be opened up. You know, anything that you're sealing has to be clean. So you have to have clean virgin material to seal to. And if you hydraulic around that, you're going to be good. But
How much space do you need to be able to get that in there?
You don't have to have tons of space. It doesn't have to be a gap, but you have to get it. But it has to be clean and something on the surface where you have hydraulic around it. So you don't have to chip around it. You don't have to have a big, half-inch opening, but it has to be clean. So what you'll find is sometimes when you're remodeling, you'll find that a shell is part of it's rebound, part of it's just poor shells, too much sand where it's just mush. You have to find something solid or it's going to fail. So people don't want to hear that, but if you have nothing solid, sometimes you just have to keep breaking away till you get something solid to stick to, because if it's too soft, it's going to move. If it moves underneath, eventually what's going to happen with the new surface? It's going to reflect through. It doesn't matter what you put on it. Answer your question? Any other questions? So hopefully that was helpful for you guys. We want you guys to be as profitable as possible. So again, your first line of defense is determine whether there's a leak and understand the difference between a leak and evaporation. If there is a leak, look at the most obvious things first. Most of you aren't going to go out and spend $20,000 on leak detection equipment. But you can find some of the basic stuff. You can get a meter and some dye and a knife. They're pretty cheap. And you can find a lot of your basic leaks with that. If it's beyond that, then that's probably when you want to call a professional who's going to do it and tell you exactly where it's at and what's happening with it. So we can determine whether it's leaking in the skimmer, is it the throat, is it the body, or is it the 90 underneath. Those things may change the way you're going to quote a customer or what you're going to do to repair it. So kind of important to know some of those things, especially if it's something you can't see. If it's something visual, it's simple. But if it's underground, Mom was telling me one was 7 feet down. That's deep. That's a tough repair. So you want to know that type of thing.
One other thing is, zero start. I see that. A lot of people, starting to press us. But a lot of these experience on any problems that we're getting leaks with those.
With what now?
With the zero edge pool or the
Yeah, that doesn't really affect leaks. It's a more complicated detection process because there's more there. So anytime you have a pool with lots of features, the leak detection gets more complicated. So if you have, a spa versus a pool, a spa is as much work detecting a leak as a pool separately. It was just single bodies of water, even though the surface area is smaller because you have more plumbing, more extrusions. So if you start adding water features, there's more to detect, there's more to go over. If you have vanishing edges, there's a lot more surface area things to look at. You have more extrusions, you probably have another pump. If you have multiple pumps, it complicates the pressure testing side of things. Because on the pressure testing, we're not just putting plugs on the returns, you've gotta plug everything. You've gotta plug everything on the inside of the pool, which includes drains and all the returns, even if they're floor returns, which could be 30 of them. And then on the equipment side, you have to plug all that up. You have to plug the air line, where it comes into the pumps, all of that has to be plugged up. And we have special tools to plug that, so you don't have to cut all the plumbing. But all of it has to be plugged to get an accurate pressure test. So vanishing edge doesn't mean that it's going to leak more, but there are more places where it could potentially leak. Any other questions? Yes.
How far can you hear the noise?
If I turn this on, I can probably hear a dog barking a block away. So they're very sensitive. So I can hear down, if it's leaking, I can hear it.
7 feet?
Oh yeah.
Huh.
Now I can't pinpoint if it's 7 feet down. The only complication to that is the deeper it gets, the more sound tends to travel and move. So the deeper it is, the harder it is to pinpoint exactly where it is, because sound will bounce and move. But 7 feet's not too deep here. And there are times when air simply won't work and you actually have to go to helium, but in general,